Goeienaand en welkom, baie dankie dat julle weer eens ingeskakel het hier by Klipkop. Ter ouder gewoonte op 'n Sondag aand 7uur. Ek dink as gevolg van beerdkrag gaan dit dalk so 'n bietjie minder kykers wees vanaand. Kom ons loer gou hierso. Dit sê vir my 1 concurrent viewer, sies vir julle. Kom ons die lig so swak. Ja, nou kan julle my beter sien. In laasweek se episode het ons gekyk na Jan wat weggejaag is. Hulle het gesê Jan doen nie goeie werk nie, hy was mos eers op Dassen eiland en Saldanha baie gewees, toe was hy op Robben eiland, en toe jaag hulle vir hom weg. Dan die Van Harwarden expeditie, waar hulle daai asmerovende kaarte vir my gesien het, waar hulle tot by Tulbag getrek het en toe weer terug. 2 mense is oorlede op hierdie tog, as ook die eerste spul slawe, 'n groot klomp slawe, het aangekom hier in die Kaap. Voor ons verder gaan wil ek ter ouder gewoonte vir almal 'n lousie in die kleedskool. Dis net Shackdweller wat vir my kyk. En die boek raak nou juis baie spannend. My genade aarde JC McFarlane het ook kom 'n lousie. Ek gaan besluit vir my koppie troos vat. Maar as dit dan nou so is, dan kan ek seker maar my kameraatjie so lank reg maak, want ek julle sommer uit die staanspoor uit direk in die oë kyk. Christoph Oukamp is ook hierso. Yes, Christoph Oukamp, lekker man, lekker. Die ou se beentjies lekker oop vlek. As kyk dat almal so omtrent so ewe lank is. Ons het al amper die tweede boek afgedraf. Is nie meer te veel bladsye oor nie, maar dit begin, amper sê ek wat hy is. Ons druk hom 'n bietjie verder in hy. Hy behoort beter te werk. Maar nou begin die groot nannas in die boek. Hierdie is nou die stukke waarvan ons die hele tyd gewag het. Dit gaan nou begin. Volgende week gaan dit nou eers eintlik begin. Maar waar wil ek wees? Ek wil graag daar wees. Maar ek wil nie julle moet hierdie sien nie. Ek gaan vir julle eers daar sit. En dan wil ek die side camera aansit. Kom ek maak gou julle brille skoon. Properties, configure video. Nou wil ek die manual focus aansit. Maak as om so 25. Kristalhelder. Ons trek nou al in Mei 1658. Goeienaand Anti-Marxist ZA. Episode 34. Ons kop af met die vryburgers. Hier kom nou nog wette. One of the Chinookwa chiefs has appeared here at the fort again today. The one from whom we bartered a large number of cattle last autumn and who promised to bring us more in the near future. The instructions of our lords and masters contained in their letter of 9 October last year, among other things, directed that the freemen were not to be allowed to barter cattle from the Hottentots, and stated that if we should deem it fit to draw up certain regulations in regard to this matter, they would have no objection but would urge us to do so in order that the freemen should not spoil the trade. The council, therefore, having received evidence that this was taking place, has decided not to delay any longer but to publish this prohibition everywhere, and the sooner the better, in the following form. Hierso as I know. As our lords and masters in the fatherland for certain reasons decreed that the freemen at the Cape should not be allowed to barter cattle or other animals from the natives, but should obtain their supplies from the company, if there were any to spare, at prices and subject to conditions fixed or still to be fixed. We hereby, in accordance with that instruction, wish to give notice thereof the freeburgers and forbid them to indulge in the cattle trade, and warn them that should they not refrain therefrom, all animals which they may be found to have bartered from the natives hereafter will be confiscated. For the purpose of the freeburgers are also ordered to return to the company within 48 hours all the remainder of the copper in their possession which was bought from the company before this order was made, and which will be taken back from them at the same price which they paid the company for it. If on expiry of this time limit, or even later on, their houses are searched by the fiscal, and it is found that they have retained some copper, such copper shall be confiscated. Nou, hulle het eers so idee gehad van die maatskappy gee vir die vryburgers die koper, dan koop die vryburgers dit op vir die maatskappy se onthaalwe. Maar dit het nou eind gekry. Hulle praat ook van report all the calves and lambs born in their herds and flocks. Dan ook forbidden to sell one another. Hulle mag ook nie vir mekaar vee verkoop nie. So Jan sit sy voet neer. Julle dink Suid-Afrika het nou baie regulasies. Nou maar toe. Vryburgers mag nie aan mekaar vee verkoop nie. Hulle mag nie by die Hottentotte vee koop in die eerste plek nie. Robben Eiland, en hier is ons nou lyk my nog wette. We will send the following goods and necessaries for the Robben Island to you by the skapenjacht. Natuurlik, ons het laasweek gesien, one book of paper and some pens. Beide Jan Woutersen en die nuwe ou, wat is sy, Olwagen of so iets, het gevra vir pen en papier asseblief. Hulle wil briefies skryf. En dan hier is ook die kanon. Hulle is besig om daar is gesien hulle soos kruit wat hulle moet stuur en allerhande goedjies vir die kanon, large cannon balls and 6 grape shot bags, ensovoorts. Dan ook 100 poles for making the kraal strong and secure, 3 lengths of old rope for making rope yarn, to be used in building the kraal instead of using nails, which are too expensive. Besides, the poles can also be fixed more securely with the yarn than with nails, as is done here. Spykers is te duur, julle moet ou tou gebruik om hierdie kraal te bou. Daar vir die mensiekies wat graag wil saamlees. Ryk Overhagen. There we go. Instructions for Ryk Overhagen of Steenwyk, appointed superintendent of the company's sheep on Robben Island. Nou praat hulle hier oor hoe die syne moet aangesteek word vir die skepe wat inkom. Dis een van die redes hoekom Jan Woutersen gefeier was. Want hulle sê ja, maar hy het nie die vuurde aangesteek nie. Maar hulle sê toch hierso, as Abram Gabema, fiscal, who visited the island recently, pointed out in his report that enough wood for beacon fires would not be obtainable there. Sien julle, hierdie was 'n probleem gewees in Jan Woutersen se tyd ook. Maar Jan Woutersen is daarvoor gefeier. Hoekom weet ek nie. Mense wat daar wil saamlees oor die vure. If you notice that the ships are foreign or not Dutch, you shall extinguish your fires. So hulle skryf basies vir hom die protokol neer. Hoe moet hy maak as hy skippe gewaar? En dan hierso is ook van as die skepe daar stop en hulle kan nog nie by die baai inkom nie, dan kan hulle gewoonlik by Robben Island uitkom. Dan sê hulle daar so 1 penguin per day for every 2 men of the ship. Unless it's an emergency, illness among the officers. Nie die offisiere, nie die manne nie. As die manne siek is, los hulle maar dis die offisiere siek is, gee maar vir hulle ekstra kos. Kan julle dit nou glo? Gaan die storieetjie van Robben Island aan. Ek wil eintlik so gou as moontlik aanspring. Hier's baie leeswerk vir my nog. Praat ek van destroy the numerous snakes. Dit smaak want daar's baie slange op die eiland gewees. Hulle sê ook allowed to fish on the island and to gut and dry fish. You shall sell it to the honourable company alone at 5 gulden per 100 pounds. Nou maar toe, daar, mens mag net aan die maatskappy enigiets verkoop. Hulle maak dit duidelik. Diplomatie, Gogosua. Waar kan ek vir jou laat staan? Ek staan vir jou daarso. Fine morning with a fair breeze to the north-northeast. The Chinookwa captain sent word that he was staying in the camp of the Kaapmans with the fat chief named Gogosua. Nou weet ons dat hier is dit nou duidelik, die fat chief se eintlike naam is Gogosua en hy is die leier van die Kaapmans. Until the return of his men, whom he had this morning sent to fetch a large number of cattle to sell us. He lives about 30 days journey from here. So hierdie Chinookwas, as hulle sê 30 days journey, dit moet diep in die binneland wees. Dit is heel moontlik al buite die Kaap-provinsie. When his servant was asked why the captain had not brought the cattle himself, he replied that he had at first come to see whether the same Dutch captain was still living here, and now that he has found this to be, he was satisfied. The Chinookwa chief had promised his chief or great captain that he would not send for cattle until he had satisfied himself about this. So hierdie is nie die groot kahuna van die Chinookwa nie. Hierdie is net 'n chief, daar's nog 'n groter chief bo hom ook. We proposed, as we had often done before, that some of our men should accompany him, but he answered no. It was still too soon, and that we should wait until his friends and natives hereabout had become more used to the Dutch, of whom they were still afraid, and so forth. During the day it began to rain fairly heavily, and the wind increased in force from the northwest. With this wind, the yacht hustled, safely arrived in the roadstead in the forenoon from the Gulf of Guinea, having left Popo. Nou maar ek het nog gekyk, dis omtrent daar by Congo, Nigeria, daar in West-Afrika. On 22 February, with 271 male and female slaves obtained there, of whom 43 had died, so that 228 slaves, including the sick, arrived here. En dit het 'n klomp slawe hier aangekom. On the outward voyage, the Hasselt had captured 2 Portuguese ships. Nou hier was nou ook nog drama van die second mate met dronkbees. Dit is net drama. Dan praat hulle hier van al die goed wat hulle daar van die produkte wat hulle gekry het. Hulle noem ook net so vir interessantheid, a Danish ship had attacked and captured the Swedish trading station at Cabo Coors. Daar is ook daar in West-Afrika rond. Op die 7de sê hulle vir ons, the male and female Guinea slaves were landed from the Hasselt. They are an exceptionally fine, strong and lively lot. Nou die volgende dag, hier begin ons allemaal al klaar weer met wette en goed. The commander and the council, strengthened by the officers of the yacht Hasselt, which returned here the day before yesterday with 228 slaves, male and female, obtained at Popo, 43 having died on the voyage, considered the dispatch of our lords and masters received from the chamber Amsterdam, and in particular the general instructions emanating from the meeting of the Lord 17 on 9 October last year regarding the employment of the said yacht and the trade. Nou maar die Here 17 het 'n paar skepe gesê, ja maar gebruik hierdie skepe en dan gaan julle aan mekaar West-Afrika en Madagaskar toe, juis vir die slawehandel. Julle gaan nou sien, Jan het gesê, dit is nou nie heeltemal so 'n goeie idee nie. Daar die mense wat wil saamlees, gaan ek gou daar opsit en dan spring ons af hierna waar geonderstreep is. Nou gee hulle hierso van hoeveel stok daar nog in die store is. Dan sê hulle, amounting in all to gulden 26,767, which calculated according to the Indian purchase price should be sufficient for the purchase of 1,000 to 1,200 slaves, enough for 4 voyages. Nou ek het nou hier 'n berekeningkie gemaak, dit beteken hulle koop per slaaf tussen 22.3 en 26.7 met hierdie getalle. Is dit omtrent 22 gulden, tussen 22 en 26 gulden per slaaf. The officers of the household gave particulars of the assortment of merchandise received from India and stated that it was ample but not properly assorted. So is die eenvoudig geweest. Which was necessary if the buyers were to conduct the slave trade according to their wishes, so that they would be obliged to take whatever the inhabitants for those of those parts wish to be rid of, that is, the young, old, halt, and lame. While, on the contrary, if the merchandise were properly assorted and consisted chiefly of bric-a-brac, and the rest of the beads and curios, they would be able to trade as they wished and would receive preference above all other traders of whatever nation. For with bric-a-brac it was possible to trade and negotiate just as you liked. En dit maak my hierdie bric-a-brac is een of ander tipe skulp. Ek het gaan kyk, hulle sê ek moet gaan kyk by in die joernaal bladsy 71 en volume 1. Ek het daarop kyk en daar sê hulle dis skulp is. Wie is ek om te stry? Julle op die einde sê hulle, the slaves being fine and strong would be useful in India. So, hulle eindig toch af om te sê, jylle op die einde, the voyage would result in a great loss rather than a profit, though the slaves being fine and strong would be useful in India. So hy sê, nee maar, ons nou eerder maar hierdie besigheid stop. Eventually it was unanimously decided after much deliberation to stay the trade for a while, as we were at the moment abundantly supplied with slaves at the Cape, not only for the Honourable Company, but also for the Freeburgers and others, and in addition to the 40 slaves from Angola sent to Batavia in the ships Wapen van Amsterdam, Amersfoort and Spreeuw, we should be able to send about 200 more to India. Ek sien hulle praat baie van, ja maar hulle het soveel slawe ingevoer, dan praat hulle van baie groot getalle. Maar ek dink daar is 'n groot moontlikheid dat hulle selektief kies. Hulle gaan kyk het, okay, hier het nou soveel slawe gestop, dan hulle ander keer soveel slawe gestop, maar hulle trek nooit af as die slawe weer weggepos word nie. Ek het so 'n gevoel dit is wat daar gebeur het. It was accordingly decided to prepare the yacht. Kom ons probeer weer. It was accordingly decided to prepare the yacht Hasselt with all speed to dispatch her to Batavia in accordance with the instruction of our lords and masters, with between 140 and 150 slaves, who would have to be refreshed in the meantime, as well as 30 of the Angola prize slaves, now completely refreshed and fit, who had been brought earlier by the Dordrecht, lying here at anchor. Hulle sê ons is besig om te wag vir die Maria om van Angola af te kom. Sy is ook daar gestuur om te handel en om te kyk of daar slawe is. Hierso is nog 'n stukkie van Robben Eiland vir die mense wat wil lees oor Robben Eiland. Ryk Overhagen teruggestuur dit vir Jan van Riebeeck. Dis nou hulle tweeetjie stuur nou vir mekaar love letters. Dis maak my Jan Woutersen is nou uit die liefdesverhouding uit. Dis nou net Jan en Ryk Overhagen. Julle op die einde sê hulle, the last buck sent is worthless. Hulle praat nou hier van hasse. As it allows itself to be bitten by the others, which chase it about. The black buck is quite good, but it seems to have forgotten the does. Nou onthou hierdie klein stukkie. Onthou daai klein stukkie, ons gaan nou weer van die hasse hoor. Nou, Vryburger slawe, okay, ek moet nog vergelyk met bladsy 267, ek gaan dit vir julle doen. Op die 9de sê hulle, the freemen and others bought Guinea male and female slaves on credit at 100 guilders each. Before this, they had also bought some Angola slaves at 50, 62.5 and 75 guilders, according to their age and size, to be employed in agriculture, wood sawing, fishing, etc. Nou ons het net nou gesien, dit kos omtrent so 25 gulde vir die eerbare maatskappy, daar so, tussen 22 en 26. So die maatskappy maak 'n redelike profijt. Diplomatie, hier kom ons nou. The Vryburger Hendrik Boom sent word that they had yesterday lost 6 cows and a bull through the carelessness of the herd, who had to look after them in the veld. He supposed that they had been driven off by the Kaapens, who had all fled with their huts and all their possessions. Their old fat chief, Gogosua, who is only with difficulty able to move about, was seized and detained by the Vryburger Jan Reinersen. En daar was nou vir die eerste keer 'n kooi gevangenis. The commander at once sent some men under the fiscal, accompanied by the Batavian Hottentot, or interpreter Anthony. Nou maar dis Anthony en Dumaan, hulle gebruik sy die twee name, maar ek dink hy wou Anthony gewees het, maar die mense het hom die bynaam Dumaan gegee. To tell the chief not to be afraid, but to see to it that the stolen cattle were restored by his men, for which he would receive some bread, tobacco, and brandy. He replied that the cattle had not been seized by his men, but by the Suwakwas, who were quick to seize an opportunity when the troop was not carefully guarded, and that they had already driven the cattle behind the Leopard Mountain. He would, however, endeavour to have them recovered by his men, and would willingly remain at the dwelling of Jan Reinertsen. Orders were accordingly given that he has to be well treated in the meantime. Wat gou so 'n swing van my koffie. Domina Morgul. Nancy. As ook rode trieter. Mense, hier is baie leeswerk vanaand. Gaan definitief op die meeste 2 maande wees wat ek gaan lees as ek daar uitkom. This disturbance somewhat alarmed the China-Hukwa chief, Kahihantima, who was staying at the commander's house while waiting for the arrival of the cattle, which according to him he asked his paramount chief to send, and which he intended to sell us. But he was so well treated and the matter so carefully explained to him that he remained quite content with the commander. He promised not to leave until he had proved that he is a man of his word and had brought us as much cattle as we were able to buy with the copper we have in stock. Nou, dis nou natuurlik die ou wat 30 dae se trek in die binneland bly. Ok, hier is nou die doodreg wat aankom aan die Kaap. Dan, ok, ek het nou nie 'n nota hier gemaak nie. In the afternoon, news was received that 6 of Hendrik Boom's cattle had been restored. So smaak was net die een bees wat nog weg is. But shortly afterwards, we heard that the Hottentots had driven off 4 oxen belonging to Visagi's company and had severely thrashed the herd, while an unknown number of cattle had also been stolen from the Stevens company. Hendrik Boom was thereupon ordered not to release the chief of the Kaapmans before all the cattle had been restored. En natuurlijk treat him well en allerlei type goed. Ek moet seker maar hier deurlees. But to treat him well in the meantime and not to threaten him in the least. For this purpose the fiscal was sent there with the interpreter Anthony to urge him in a kindly manner to cause restitution to be made and to exhort him to see to it that no more unpleasantness or thefts were committed by his people. To prevent the disputes which would result therefrom, and to do anything else which was necessary in the best interest of all. Oef. Hierdie is nou die begin van 'n groot bom wat ontplof. Shortly afterwards, the fiscal arrived at the fort with the chief mentioned and reported that all Hendrik Boom's cattle had been restored to him, and that none of the other stolen cattle had been found among the chief's herds. He suspected that they had been stolen by the chora gahoekwas, chora gahoekwas, or tobacco thieves, encamped 3 hours away. Between them and the chief there was a feud at present, with the result that he did not dare to send any of his own men to ask for the cattle, which he would otherwise gladly have done. So die Kaapmans in die chora gahoekwas is kwaai vir mekaar. Fair weather, as ek nou actually by die Peguin gaan na Dassen Eiland toe, die Vryburgers, hulle gaan vang weer vis. Hulle sê ook, meanwhile, the commander visited the lands of the freemen and the company, and also inquired whether Visagi's company had recovered all their cattle, as they had neglected to send word about it. He found that the cattle were still missing, and that the rest of the freemen were busily engaged in ploughing, sowing, etc. Likewise the men on the company's lands, while about 20 slaves were pulling up bushes and trees. Further orders regarding the work were given, and the men were urged to do their best. In the meantime, men of Visagi's company came to tell the commander on the lands that they had caught 3 of the Gorochokwas, who had confessed that they had stolen the cattle, but that 2 of them had again escaped. Soldiers have therefore been sent to them to guard the 3rd captive and to keep him in custody until the cattle are restored. Hier praat nou van die Gorochokwas, maar hierbo het ek gesukkel met hierdie naam Choragahoekwas. Dis moeilik om altyd 100% seker te wees, maar dis duidelik hulle praat hier van die Gorochokwas en die Choragahoekwas as dieselfde stam, as dieselfde groepie. Today the death occurred of one of the crew of the vloot Meese. He was Klaas Evertson of Dergoude, sailmaker, and had been left behind ill. Op die 15de, in the morning, our soldiers again arrived at the fort and reported that the freemen had allowed the 3rd captive Hottentot to escape also, after a cow and a sheep had already been offered for his ransom. It therefore seems likely that they will keep clear of the net and never restore the stolen cattle. On account of this disturbing possibility, we are meanwhile taking trouble to keep Kahihantima contented and to persuade him to remain with us until a large number of cattle and sheep, as that was promised by him, shall have been brought here and sold to us. He was away for 2 days in the camp of the Kaapmans, but returned this evening and was more liberally treated than before in the commander's house, and accommodated for the night. Now and again he was also made jolly and happy with a little brandy. Dat is nou natuurlijk die ou wat van diep in die binneland afkom. Op die 16de, the Free Saldanha traders left for the Dassen Island for the purpose stated. Some of the Chinahoekwas arrived here today. With 4 head of cattle. Although these were but middling, they were at once bought from them. Chahihantima now asked for a present of some copper plates, as he wanted to go home and return soon with a large number of cattle. Nou, ons het nou die dag gehoor, hy het gebeloof, hy is 'n man vir sy woord, en hy gaan hierso wag totdat al die vee hierso is, en dan kon ons nou ruil. Nou ewe skielik soek hy 'n bietjie koper, hy wil nou eers die mense gaan haal. He was told that if he did that, he might be sure of receiving a good present of copper plates, but that we would first like to see the result of his big promises before we presented him with copper, the most valuable thing in their estimation. He was nevertheless well treated to food, drink, and tobacco, and with this consolation he allowed himself this evening to be cradled to sleep. Hulle sê nog also, met welke blokvanger zich deze avondlied in slaap wiegen? Op die 17e, rainy weather with northwest wind. Chayantima left for home, his knapsacks and belly filled with bread and brandy and his hands with tobacco, pretending that the Chayanohukwa or his chief's people were afraid to come here without him, that he first had to return, and on receiving good testimony about the Dutch from him, they would resolve to accompany him here with a large number of cattle, which he said would happen in 4 or 5 weeks. This is most desirable, especially since oxen are so badly needed for agriculture that some cows are being used for that purpose at present. As the latter are not strong enough, they become exhausted, which is detrimental to breeding. Nou ek begin wonder al, ek gaan nou 'n smookbreek vat. Ons trek nou by die 18e, help my onthou asseblief. Ek dink die ouens wat al hoe meer kans, hulle kom na Jan toe met groot stories, sê hulle, ek is 'n groot chief, en ek kom, ek het nou 'n maand getrek, om vir jou die nuus te bring, man, hier kom vee, jy sal nie ons vee kan uitkoop, so brand, weet hulle kry brandewyn, brood, en hulle gaan dan lekker goed, jy word soos 'n koning behandel dan. Die ouens het dit agtergekom. Tomina Morgul sneaks in, ja nee, ek stem saam met wat Klip gesê het. Tomina Morgul, dit gaan nou een van die dae gebeur. Dit gaan nou een van die dae gebeur. Goeienaand, rode trieter. As ook ys swart. Tomina, ek het vooruit gelees nog, want toe hierdie storie eers begin het, ek kon nie ophou lees nie. Ek het my hele Saterdag net gelees. Die boek raak nou verskriklik opwindend. Ek dink jy gaan baie tevrede wees. But they waste no time dragging some old chief into the confinement who can barely walk. How brave and assertive. Gogosua, there we go, the fat captain. Geert Wilders, goeienaand Geert Wilders. Lanklaas vir jou gesien. Ek is net nie lekker met die feit dat hulle altyd 'n ander naam gebruik vir al hierdie stamme wat aan die Kaap is. Of selfs verder dieper binneland. Dit maak dit baie moeilik om die spesifieke stamme uit te ken, maar ons raak hom nou so half gewoond. Die Chayanohukwas en die Kaapmans en daai manne. Geert Wilders vra of ek vir Simonei Kerseboom gesien het. Ja, ek het vir Simonei Kerseboom gesien. Ek het vir Simonei Kerseboom gesien. Het die Forum voor Demokrasie, het hulle 'n plan om van ons mense te onttrek, om julle getalle daar in Nederland aan te vul. Want dit smaak my die Europese Unie waarvoor julle tog so lief is. Waarvoor julle tog so lief is en waarvoor julle nie kan sê nee nie. Het gesê julle het immigrante nodig as gevolg van die vergrysende Nederland, vergrysende populasie. Wil julle nie dalk eerder dit incentivize vir Suid-Afrikaners om oor te gaan Holland toe nie? Ek dink dis 'n uitstekende plan. Ek twyfel sterk die Suid-Afrikaners gaan julle standbeelde kom omgooi. Ja, ek verstaan, sy is nie heeltemal Suid-Afrikaans nie, sy is eintlik Nederlands. Maar het 'n groot deel haar studie daar in Suid-Afrika en toe sy weer terug Nederland toe. Ek het daai maiden speech gesien. Dis besonders geweest. Kom ek sit dit sommer vir julle op terwyl ek rook. Ek gaan dit vir julle opsit. Sommer vir julle wys ek het dit actually kom ek gaan dit gou hierso. Ek vind hom gou. Byt net vas. Ek is nou met julle. Dan kan ek rustig rook en julle kan TV kyk. Dit is nogal 'n tydjie terug al gewees. Hier sê the tweet is unavailable. Byt net gou vas. Desktop. Kom ek haal my gefret hier vanaf. Sê. Oké, ek gaan myself gou.
Ik ben een Nederlander. Ik ben gevormd door de grote denkers, de zeevaarders, de beroemde schilders en... Voorzitter, ik ben een Nederlander. Ik ben gevormd door de grote denkers, de zeevaarders, de beroemde schilders en schrijvers en de vernieuwers die de Nederlandse geschiedenis rijk is. Door de boeren, de arbeiders en de ondernemers op wie het fundament van ons land gebouwd is. Ik ben gevormd door een natie die gelooft in vrijheid in al haar facetten. Een natie waar gelijkwaardigheid een fundamenteel begrip is. Een natie die samen veert als het Nederlands elftal wint. Een natie die samen rouwt als tragedie ons treft. Door mijn aderen vloeit ook het bloed van de Afrikaners. Een volk dat tot stand is gekomen door die ver verlaten vlaktes en die kreen van Ossewa. Maar ik ben ook de vrucht van de VOC, van de Cape Slaven, van Krotoa, van Engels kolonialisme, van de geschiedenis van heldhaftigheid, maar ook van diep trauma. Van koloniaal nationalisme, Afrikaner nationalisme, African nationalism en rainbow nationalism. Ik draag de geschiedenis van vele naties, van vele mensen en vele talen. En elke tulpvormige stoel in deze zaal vertegenwoordigt ook een verhaal en een geschiedenis. Verhalen van verschillende achtergronden en afkomst. Maar toch delen we allemaal hetzelfde grote verhaal. Het verhaal dat ons verbindt. Het verhaal dat we gevormd zijn door dit land dat we met elkaar delen. En hoewel de overeenkomsten soms moeilijk te vinden zijn, delen we dit. Onze liefde voor ons Nederland en een vastberaden toewijding om haar bevolking te dienen. Voorzitter, zoals ik hier sta als gevolg van de historische ontmoeting tussen Europa en Afrika, een ontmoeting die de wereld veranderd heeft, staan wij hier allen om vandaag thema's te bespreken die onze wereld weer fundamenteel kunnen veranderen. Dat geldt in de eerste plaats voor de invoering van het coronapaspoort. Laat ik helder zijn. Vorm voor Democratie is tegen iedere vorm van een coronapaspoort en tegen iedere vorm van een testsamenleving. Ook het kabinet schrijft belang te hechten aan geen directe of indirecte vaccinatiedwang. Tegelijkertijd is het dit kabinet dat binnen Europa dwars ligt als het gaat om het gratis verstrekken van testen. Het lijkt zo logisch. De overheid voert een testplicht in, dus de overheid betaalt de test. Maar Nederland ligt dus dwars. Dit kabinet laat gewone gezinnen straks honderden euro's extra betalen om op vakantie te kunnen, terwijl de vaccins wel gratis zijn. Dat leidt dus tot indirecte vaccinatiedwang. Onderkent de premier dat? Voorzitter, onze vrijheid is in gevaar. Vorm voor Democratie zou het liefst zien dat het kabinet helemaal zou afzien van dit onzalige plan. Maar als die coronapaspoorten er dan toch komen, wil de premier dan stoppen met dwarsliggen? Wil de premier toezeggen dat de GGD reiscertificaten afgeeft na het uitvoeren van een gratis test? En is de premier bereid om binnen de EU...
Van een onzalige plan kan je nou meer. Mensen, daar is Simonei Kerseboom vir julle. Sy het, ek dink is uit haar ma of haar pa, ek is nie seker wat hy is Suid-Afrikaner. Kom ek sit gou weer hierdie ouetjie op. Kom ek moet net gou vinnig julle, ek maak gou klaar met die Die terugkeer, die Forum vir Demokrasie doen nie baie goed in parlement hier. Dit is nie baie setels wat gewen word nie. Is my klank aan? Ja. Brendan Campbell lê in sy bed met 'n gasheater wat daar sing. Ek moet ook vir my gas kry. Ek dink net nie die Suid-Afrikaners wat hulle self sien as Nederlanders weet waarvan hulle praat nie. In Nederland kan ek gaan ontbyt eet met sterk koffie en 'n vet zol. Brendan Campbell, hier's vir jou 'n spesiale stukkie in hierdie boek vanaand. Ek gaan vir jou beloof. Dit gaan heel waarskynlik 'n glimlag op jou gesig sit. Op die 18de, Chahiantima returned in the forenoon, showing various wounds received from some slaves belonging to our farmers. Nou natuurlik, hierdie is nou die ou wat nou die groot massa vee van ons globaal. En dit smaak my die slawe wat nou die dag hier aangekom het hom bietjie gewiks. The fiscal, the sergeant and the interpreter Anthony was sent out with him so that he might point out the slaves who had done it and to discover the reason for their action. On their return, they reported that he had been assaulted by those at Bosheuvel. Nou, Bosheuvel is, sover as wat ek weet, is dit Jan van Riebeeck se grond. Nee, Bosheuvel, dis hier by Wynberg grond, hier aan die onderkant. En as ek het reg het, is dit Jan van Riebeeck se grond. Because he and some men had come among the plough cattle of those farmers, and the slaves had feared that they intended to steal them. One of the Guinea slaves indicated to him to go away, but as it seemed as if he would not leave their cattle, which were in the slaves' charge, the latter had called one of his comrades, who had let loose the dog, which had overtaken Chayantima and prevented him from escaping. The slaves rushed at him and would have killed him if our Netherlanders themselves had not liberated the Hottentots. As a result of this incident, we had great difficulty in pacifying him again, but succeeded in doing so. All the freemen were also ordered to refrain from keeping any of them under restraint. As today, the chief of the Chorachohuquas himself had been to the fort and had sold us 9 head of cattle. He had promised to take care in future to keep his cattle away from those of the freemen, which we strongly urged him to do, to prevent further discord, so that we might henceforth live as good friends. After he had been filled with bread, tobacco, and brandy, and had been well treated, he left, promising in future to bring us cattle daily. Chayantima passed the night in the commander's house, intending to leave tomorrow with new presents and necessaries for the return journey. Die Chayantima word omtrent bederf. En hier sê hulle op Sondag die 19de Mei 1658, Chayantima left with fresh provisions, being well satisfied. He said that he would return in a few weeks with a large number of cattle. Op die 20ste alweer 'n resolusie. Dit gaan nou weer oor die boere. Ek gaan nie deur alles lees nie. Ek gaan net so vir julle die highlights gee. Our lords and masters have repeatedly in their dispatches ordered us earnestly, among other things, to make a commencement with the harder and other fisheries for feeding this garrison, workmen and slaves, and in particular for supplying the return ships passing here annually. Julle kan daar verder gaan lees oor aanbel van goeds. Hulle sê hier, whereas we daily observe that they not only display as much zeal in fishing as in growing wheat, but seek to obtain their main profit from it by selling the fish to the men here and to the ships at the highest possible price, without offering a single fish to the honorable company. Nou, dis nou natuurlik die vryburgers. En ek het die vorige paar episodes gesê, Jessie man, hierdie vryburgers, hulle gaan aan mekaar loop visvang. En hier maak hulle dit nou duidelik, maar hier kom nou weer wetgewing as gevolg van daai, hoor hierso. Permit the freeman until further orders to fish freely with nets, drag nets and in other ways. So dit maak my, hulle spoor dit aan. Everywhere in the sea and the rivers, but forbid them and the Saldanha traders and especially the company servants to sell fish, fresh, salted or dried fish to ships or anybody else except the honorable company. Dus ja, asseblief gaan vang vis, maar julle mag dit aan ander mense verkoop, net aan ons. En natuurlik teen die prys wat ons vir julle aanbied. Daar kan jy sien, hulle gee soveel guldes en stibes per pond en per 100 pond ensovoorts. Die mense wat daarin belangstel, kan daar gaan loop deurlees. So ja, asseblief gaan vang vis, maar julle mag dit nie meer vrylik verkoop, julle mag dit net aan ons verkoop teen 'n vasgestelde prys. En hier kry mense promosie en so aan. Ek gaan dit net vir julle opsit vir die mense wat graag wil saamlees. En dan op die 21ste, the Hasselt shipped 102 Guinea and Angola male and female slaves for Batavia. Nou maar daar kan julle nou sien, daar's nou 'n klomp slawe weg. Ek wonder of die mense wat so hulle wiskunde doen van hoeveel slawe was ingevoer in die Kaap, of hulle hierdie getalle afgetrek het. Ek wonder. Hierso is nou alweer by Robben Eiland in Jan van Riebeeck en Ryk, wat is die ou se naam? Ryk Overhagen, hulle skryf vir mekaar love lettertjies. Ek het net gaan onderstreep hierso. As soon as the gunner arrives there with the boat, you are to fire the gun after dark, so that we may know whether it is possible to hear you in case of emergency or trouble. Dan hier op die volgende dag sê hulle, the cannon fired there for a trial could just be heard. So hulle kon hom net hoor. En hierdie gaan nou ook oor die boerdery. In grond en so aan, hoeveel grond geploeg is. Ek gaan nie te lank daaroor hang nie. Julle kan daar gaan lees. Ek het tog onderstreep hierso, raw land which has been plowed for the first time proves to be not as good as land which has been under cultivation for a longer period. Ons natuurlik beesmis en goed ingewerk by die grond wat klaar gewerk is. Hier is nou nog Robben Eiland. En hulle sê, they had however been so badly looked after by his predecessor, Jan Woutersen. Hierdie arme Jan Woutersen het alles verkeerd gedoen, maar dit maak my hierdie Ryk Overhagen doen nou alles reg. Ek weet nie wat die verskil is nie. Op die einde sê hulle, some Dutch rams are also to be sent there for the purpose of breeding crossbreeds and in due course pure breeds. It has been found that these commonly bear more than one lamb, while the Cape sheep bear only one. For the lambs too, they have much more milk than the Cape sheep. So ons weet nou definitief daar's die Hollandse skaap en dan was hier 'n eie soortige ras skaap hier aan die Kaap gewees. Diplomatie, diefstal, okay, hier moet ek. Fine, clear weather in the morning. During the night, some Hottentots tried to scale the wall of the company's cattle kraal behind the fort, but the guard detected one who had already from the outside scaled the wall or parapet, which had caved in somewhat, and had struck him with a sword, wounding him in the thigh, according to the guard's report, but the Hottentot nevertheless escaped. Altogether, it is clear that the Hottentots will not let slip any opportunity of harming us. Hier praat hulle nou weer oor Robben Eiland. A Guinea slave was also sent over at the request of Ryk Overhagen, who stated that one more hand was needed to rid the sheep of numerous vermin. Toe Jan Woutersen gevra het vir 'n ou, toe sê hulle vir hom, nee, maar nou vra Ryk, nou kry hy. Ek dink hulle was baie onregverdig geweest teenoor Jan Woutersen. Hierso is nou nog 'n resolusie, Ryk Overhagen of Steenwyk. Ek hoop nou net nie, hy is 'n voorvader van die Vanwyke nie. Dit sal my baie teleurstel. In elk geval, hier praat hulle van hoe amazing Ryk is en hoe KAK Jan Woutersen was. En hulle sê hierso, confirmed in the post of superintendent of the company sheep on the Robben Island. As dit nou official. Hy en Jan skryf vir mekaar baie love lettertjies. Dan praat hulle weer hier van die Peguin. She brought more than 800 pounds of seal meat for the slaves and some eggs to sell to the ships. Jy sien, die ouens mag nou nie meer vleis verkoop, hulle mag nie meer vis verkoop, nou verkoop hulle maar die eiers. Die ouens wil net 'n geregverdige prys kry vir hulle goed. Die praat nou van die Maria keer terug uit Angola uit. Daar kan julle sien dat die Maria nou kom nou terug uit Angola uit. Maar die Maria het amper niks daar gekry nie. Julle kan daar gaan saamlees as julle wil. Ek het tog onderstreep dat die robbejag is maar saam met die Maria gestuur op Angola toe. Maar dit smaak my die robbejag is daar op die rotse en die robbejag is nou klaar. Die eerste skip in die Kaap gebou, daar is hy nou weg. Praat hulle daaronder ook weer van after the loss of the robbejag. Maar die Maria het teruggekom, niks slawe gekry en niks om te trade of niks nie. Dit is baie onvrugbaar gewees. Waaroor praat ons nou? Ek dink oor hierdie hele ding moet lees. Hier praat hulle weer van waar die eerbare maatskappy gesê het, Madagaskar en Angola en Wes-Afrika en so aan. Sê hulle hierso, dispatched to Batavia because they did not deem it advisable under the present circumstances to employ that vessel for the Madagascar trade. So Jan van Riebeeck sê, dis nie moeite werd om Wes-Afrika toe te gaan nie, dis ook nie moeite werd om Madagaskar toe te gaan nie. Ek het tog hierso geonderstreep, whereas we consider that we are at present adequately supplied with slaves as a result of the arrival of the Hasselt, and only 50 or 60 lasts of rice will be required from Madagascar for feeding both the slaves and the population of the Cape, numbering 360 mouths, made up as follows. Uiteindelik nou, hier kry ons nou 'n telly van wie is almal hierso. In the garrison, 80, with 15 sick, Dutch women and children, 20, healthy and sick slaves of the Honourable Company, 98, freemen, 51, male and female slaves of freemen and others, 89, and 7 exiles, making a total of 360 persons to be fed. Nou ek het 'n bietjie die goedjies bymekaar getel, daar's 15 siek mense, daar's 151 blankes, 187 slawe, as ook 7 bandiete, waarvoor die VOC nou verantwoordelik is, en die totaal daarso is 360. Ek het nogal, soos wat die slawe weghardloop en terugkom, het ek geplus en geminus. Die wiskunde klop actually nogal. Kan jy dit glo? Hulle praat ook hier van Southland, dit smaak my hulle het van na Australië verwys as Southland in daai dae. Hulle hier bevestig hulle, completely suspend the trade with Madagascar, Guinea and Angola. Furthermore, because of the loss of the robbejag, we are at present in great need of a vessel to sail to the Saldanha Bay. Aan die onderkant sê hulle, more than 200 slaves to be fed daily by the Honourable Company and the freemen. Maar toe ek die wiskunde hier gedoen het, toe sê hulle vir my, dis 187, en dis nie meer as 200 nie. Ek weet nie hoe hulle wiskunde gewerk het daai tyd nie. Meanwhile, the 2 carpenters from the Maria were busy boarding up and putting a deck on the second boat taken from the Wapen van Holland in order to make it fit for sailing to the Saldanha Bay and the islands to fetch as large a cargo as possible. Ek gaan nou, daar moes 'n klomp mense gestrand ook, hulle moes vir die gestrande mense gaan soek het, maar dit smaak my van die gestrande mense het weggehardloop, en van die mense moes nog betaal geword het, van hulle het skuld gehad by die maatskappy, en het hulle nou net boek gehou Vir die wat belangstel, miskien is julle van ook daar tussenin. Dalk een van jou voorvaders word hierso genoem. En hier kom ons nou eers by Junie uit en ek is nou amper 'n uur al aan die gang. Hier begin hardloop die slawe nou weg. Last night 5 male and 2 female Angola slaves deserted. Maar voordat ek daar aangaan, ga ek eers 'n sigaretjie opsteek. Ek is jammer. Julle gaan vanaand nou maar moet deurdruk met my. Yes, ek onthou nog van die bandiete. Ek het gedog as meer bandiete. Smaak my, daar's net 7. Ek het van die goed wat ek gemis, wat nie op hierdie skerm is nie. Goeienaand, Mike Simpson. Ok, ek gaan hom van hier af vat. Mike Simpson vra om verskoning, dis laat. Jy kan altyd vir load shedding blameer, Mike Simpson. Ek sal jou vergewe. Mike Simpson sê vir ons, was my verjaarsdag laas week. 58, maar voel 85 vandag. Lekker verjaar, ou maat, lekker verjaar. Ek hoop Fini, die kinders en die kleinkinders het jou lekker bederf. Tomina Morgul het ewe vir ons koek gebak vir die partytjie vir Mike Simpson. Vra, kry jy mens nog so iets soos bandiete? Ek weet nie, wat is die korrekte definisie vir 'n bandiet? En ek sê, ek moet seker my telefoon ook afsit. Al nie so trrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr So ons het so effens 'n voorsmaakie gekry van loodgooi tye wat op pad is. En hier begin raak het nou meer ernstig. Wag julle net. Ek gaan nou maar deurdruk. Ek dink ons gaan miskien vanaand tot 9 uur toe aanloop. Maar anders kom ons nie klaar met die boeke. Ek moet op en ons gesels. En op ons het 'n rok en die boek klaar lees. Free labor, as ek reg verstaan, daar in die Kaap, daar by Leeukop op, man, seker tot 3/4 op teen Leeukop op, is daar mooi klippe gepak, waar die mense kan by Leeukop opstap, en as ek het reg het, was dit bandiete geweest, wat die klippe daar moes opdra, een vir een, in hierdie voetpaadjie, bou, dat die mense, die vrye mense kan daar kan opstap. Daar kan miskien vir my gelieg geweest het ook, dis ook altyd 'n moontlikheid. Moet dit ook nie vat as wet nie, maar dis nou maar die storie wat ek gehoor het. Ek is eintlik verbaas, my stream bly groen. Gewoonlik saam met load shedding is die internet baie swak. Alright. Vinnig om gedouble clutch. Kom ek lig uit gaan my alie weer. Dit smaak my, blikslaar. My lyf. My lyf. Koeka, is my... Oeh. Die hond nou iemand gesien hierso. Okay, Klipkop. Desktop, here we go. Ons is nog hierso afgesluit. Last night, 5 male and 2 female Angola slaves deserted. So ons was by 187 minus 7, so daar is nou 180 slawe, 7 het verdwyn. Deserted. Hulle het genagereg. From the forest, 2 from the fort and 2 pairs from the company's grain fields. These were among the first to arrive here. They had all been incited to it by the oldest slave from the forest, who the day before yesterday had pretended that he was ill and accordingly had to come to the fort and along the way had visited the slaves at the company's grain fields. Shortly after midnight, the 3 had left the fort and had been joined the next morning by those from the grain fields, evidently at a signal given to one another in passing. Men were immediately sent out in all directions to look for the deserters. Also some Hottentots, who were encouraged by the promise of large rewards if they brought the fugitives back and were given tobacco and bread in advance to take with them on the journey. Okay, dan die Maria en Pagain, hulle gaan natuurlijk mos nou weer Saldanha Bay toe en das 'n eiland en so aan. Spring sommer gou daar ook. Hier kom ons nou terug by die slawe, die slawe wat geëiwol het. Kan ek vir jou reg ophou? Neither Dutch nor Hottentots have yet brought back any of the fugitive Angola slaves, no matter which were sent out in search of them, nor what they were given and promised beforehand. Fresh soldiers and Hottentots have accordingly been sent out daily in order, if possible, to catch some of them and make an example of them before the others to prevent a reoccurrence. It is feared, however, that they will hide themselves as they are old and clever customers, and according to the other Angola slaves, men from the highlands of the interior and cannibals. Op die 6de, fine morning as before, the surveyor and 4 soldiers returned. They had been out the day before yesterday, as on the preceding days, to chart accurately all the rocks extending into the sea. Ja, ek moet het ook lees. Along the outside coast of the Cape for the benefit of the company's ships touching here, and in addition to scout everywhere and be on the lookout for the runaway Angola slaves, but they reported that they had not seen any of them. Op die 7de, the commander went out to visit all the lands of the freemen and the company, and after giving the necessary orders with regard to agriculture and other matters, returned home after dark, where there was as yet no news about the runaway slaves. Op die 8de, various Hottentots reported to the fort that the slaves were not to be found, but we fear that they have in fact found them and thereupon killed them, as they had done before in the case of the Madagascar slave Anthony, for they are very jealous of the slaves and cannot bear them, being always at loggerheads with them. Okay, hier praat hulle van die geelmuitjen wat in swak weer hierso is. Nou, dit is nou the officers of the geelmuitjen were given their dispatch. So 'n bietjie in die moeilikheid gewees, maar dit gaan nou oor 'n skippietjie. Nie te interessant vir my nie. In die volgende stukkie gaan ook nou weer oor die boerdery. Maar hier kom ons nou. Die prins Willem kom ook hierso aan. En dan kom ons nou weer by die slawe uit. Today the Hottentots from the kraal of the Kaapmans visited the fort, stating that their women had seen some of the runaway Angola slaves on the coast between here and the Saldanha Bay, but their menfolk were unable to find or capture them in order to bring them back here. Op die 16de, the ship which had anchored off the Robben Island entered the bay, but on account of the calm, she was unable to reach the proper anchorage. Okay, wacht, dit is nog deel van die geel merchant. Nee, van die Prins Willem. Is dit hy? Prins Willem from Zeeland. 472 men on board. 16 had died, while 60 and 70 were suffering from scurvy. En hier is nou weer love letters wat na Robben Island toegestuur word en terug. Hierdie kom nou van, wat is die bliksem se naam? Ryk Overhagen. As julle Ryk Overhagen se love letters wil lees, kan julle daar loop lees. Ek net een stukkie wat ek vir julle wil sê. Hier praat hulle van a total of 23 old ewes and lambs died. Hulle het vir Jan Wouterson weggejaag, omdat daar skape, elke nou na skape gevrek het. Hier gebeur dit nou met hierdie ou ook, man, dis alright. Maar hoor hierso. The white doe produced 3 young rabbits. They are as swift as the wind. We believe the mother is again with young. Also the large grey one, which I at first told your honor was a buck. There we go. Toe sê glad nie 'n bak nie. Toe is die bak sommer nou pregnant. Maar daar is die einde van die love letters. Hier kom ons nou lang leesstuk. The freeman Casper Brinkman came to complain with tears in his eyes that all 4 of his Guinea slaves, male and female, had deserted during the night. Daar sien daar, hulle gaan nou praat van nog een, daar's 5 wat weg is. And also a female slave belonging to Harman's company, with 50 or 60 pounds of rice, some clothing, etc., though according to the freeman, the slaves had never been treated badly, locked up or beaten by them. Our men are unable to pursue them because of their fleetness of foot, and the 7 runaway Angola slaves of the company have hitherto not been recaptured, though the Hottentots have been given ample inducement in the form of fair promises. We find at present that they are quite unwilling or very reluctant to look for the fugitives, with the result that we are beginning to suspect that they incite and harbour them, or that they may have exchanged them in the interior for cattle and other things. Accordingly, some Hottentots were sent to Harry, who had not been to the fort for a long time. When he arrived in the afternoon, he was informed of the desertion of the slaves. After being encouraged to bring them back, he promised to do his best to recapture at least some of them, if not all, on condition that he and the Kaapmans should be allowed to dwell in the vicinity of the fort at all times, as good friends and neighbours with their huts and cattle, which are numerous and sought after for good reason, in order to be better protected against the natives from the far interior. After he had been well treated to brandy, tobacco and food, and his belly and bags also filled with bread and rice, he left, promising to do his utmost to recapture the slaves. Some soldiers were also sent out for the same purpose, but they returned in the evening after a fruitless quest. In the morning, strong south-southeasterly wind with occasional rain showers and drifting clouds. The fiscal and the sergeant was sent round to all the freemen in order, as has often been done before, to warn them to treat their slaves properly and not to make them surly by continual beating, thumping and scolding, lest more run away. Moenie julle slawe moer nie. Oef. Ok, daar praat hulle van die manne van die Prins Willem, wat gaan hout kap het. Hulle het gaan hout kap op 'n area wat Jan graag wou laat saai. Sê ja, maar vat sommer daardie bome wat daar staan, dan kap julle daardie bome af vir hout vir die boot, en dan kan ek volgende jaar of een of ander tyd daar begin saai, daar waar julle die bome uitgeroei het. Hier gaan ons nou aan met die slawe, diplomatie, Eva en Domaan. Hier raak die ding nou dik. Ook. Kom, laat hom maar eers hierso staan. Fine weather with a northwesterly breeze, the freeman Jan Reinersen came to complain early in the morning that during the night all his male and female slaves had run away, taking with them 3 or 4 blankets, clothing, rice, tobacco, etc. We thereupon called the new interpreter Duman, now called Anthony, who had returned from Batavia with the Honourable Cunius, and asked him why the Hottentots would not search for the runaway slaves, to which he coolly replied that he did not know. The commander, not trusting him, then called the interpreter Eva, dis nou natuurlijk Krotua, alone into his office and privately asked her whether our blacks were not being harboured by the Hottentots. On this she asked whether such was the commander's opinion, and being answered in the affirmative, she, speaking good Dutch, said these words, namely, I tell you straight out, Meneer van Riebeeck, Duman is no good. He told the Hottentots everything that was said in Meneer's room the day before yesterday. When I told him that it was wrong to do so, he replied, I am a Hottentot, and not a Dutchman, but you, Eva, try to curry favour with the commander. She added, Meneer, I also believe that the fat captain of the Kaapmans harbours the slaves. Nou daar sê Eva nou ja, maar dit is actually die fat captain. Ek het nêrens raak gelees dat hulle toe eventually vir die fat captain vrygelaat het. Ek is nie heeltemal seker of hy nog gevangenes is of nie. On being asked what the chief would do with the slaves, Eva replied, he will present them to the Kochokwas to retain their friendship, and they in turn will deliver the slaves to the Hankumkwas, living far from here and cultivating the soil in which they grow dacha. What is dacha? A dry herb which the Hottentots chew, which makes them drunk, and which they highly esteem. She begged us earnestly not to disclose the fact that she had told us this. If we did not, she would always speak openly. She advised us to seize the 3 sons of the fat captain. Nou hierso is nou die 3 seuns van die fat captain. Ek weet nie of ek dit reg uitspreek nie. Is dit Shasher? O ja, ek seker die kamera strooi, julle kan lees. Shasher. Shacher. Pieter Otengo and Jan. Ons gaan later aan dis Jan Kau. When they would speedily restore the blacks. All this she repeated today in the presence of the senior merchant Willem Bastink. Thereafter the commander went out on horseback with the Honourable Bastink and the fiscal to visit the camps of Harry and the Kaapmans. But when he reached the Fresh River, nou maar die varse rivier is natuurlijk die Amstel. Kom ons sit hom gou weer op die desktop. Hierso is die Kaap, hier lê Tafelberg, nou maar dis net hierso. Hierso is die varse rivier. Hy vloei so rondom Tafelberg, hier by Soutrivier eindig hy. He found that the Kaapmans had already moved as far as the Leopard Mountain with all their huts and livestock. Harry had moved his camp nearer to us, however, and was busy erecting his huts. We saw there Shkasher, Pieter Otengo and Jan, but it was not considered advisable to lay hands on them for the purpose mentioned, but rather to keep up the pretense for the present until we lured them into the fort. To achieve this end, the commander kindly requested them, they and Harry, bring the principal persons to go and look for the blacks, and offered to provide them for the journey with bags, of bread and tobacco, which they only had to come fetch at the fort. He also promised to pay them as a reward for every black man, as they call the slaves, as much copper as for a large ox, as well as a liberal supply of brandy, tobacco, and rice, if they brought the fugitives back. Thereupon the chief men were presented with some tobacco, and a few pieces were thrown among the common people to scramble for them. The latter is the sign of reassurance when the commander visits them with a stranger. They are otherwise timid when they see someone who seems to be of higher rank than a skipper or a superior officer. In the evening we received news that Harman Harman went out to cut reeds towards the Leopard Mountain about 2 hours off, had seen the 4 runaway slaves of Jan Reinersen going straight to the Kaapens, and that Harman had pursued them and had caught and recovered 1. Maar ons totaal lê nou al op 15 altesaam. Want daar was 4 weg en daar het een gerecover. But the others were too swift-footed and had escaped in a northeasterly direction. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the fiscal and the sergeant were sent out to bring the recaptured slave to the fort to try and discover why they had run away and who had incited or persuaded them thereto. They were also ordered to inspect the livestock of the freemen, as it said that they kill their sheep and cattle and sell the meat to the ships, which hampers the increase and is very injurious to the honourable company, for most of them are still drawing as much salt meat and pork from the stores on credit as they can get. They also draw other provisions, thereby incurring a large debt without much prospect of paying it off at present, especially if they do not pay proper attention to their stock breeding and grain growing. It has also been observed that some pay more attention to their bartering and trading with the ships and the profits derived therefrom than to the necessary agriculture and stock breeding. Maar ek het dieselfde agtergekom. Die ouens is nie eintlik baie lief vir die boerbesigheid nie. Verloop visvang, ja. Ons is nie boere nie, ons is vissermanne. Ja, hier is nog baie bladsye. Diplomatie, gevangenisse. The fiscal and the sergeant were instructed to see how much land each freeman had prepared for sowing barley, the season for which is approaching and should not be neglected. They were further told of their return journey to try by fair words to induce the Hottentots mentioned, sons of the fat captain named Gogosua, to come with them to the fort, in order that we might thereafter consider whether they should be seized or what other action should be taken in the matter. Nou hier kom nou weer 'n resolusie. Ek gaan gou 'n halwe sigaret hier rook. Ek moes eintlik my waterbotteltjie saamgebring het. Kom ons kyk gou hierso. Wat sê die mense? Sheikh Dwelle sê, lekker staan ek gras en skêr in die hand, terwyl jy so praat. Dis nou heel toevallig. Geniet hom, Sheikh Dwelle. Ek sien julle is besig om die mark te analiseer hier in die kletskolom. Klip se degenerate chat. Eerste keer daar. Ja, julle moet maar aangaan met julle geselsies daar so. Ek het nou nie kommentaar om op daai te lewer nie. Ek het nie kommentaar om op daai te lewer nie. Oké. Waar trek ons nou? Ek gaan Junie klaarmaak. Ons is nou by die 22ste. Ja, is nou by die 22ste Junie. Right, toe. Desktop, there we go. Resolution, wat as hierdie Jan 'n resolution skryf, weet jy, hier kom het nou. About noon, the sons of the chief of the carpenters, Shkasher and Peter Otengo, with Harry and some others, came to the hall of the fort. The principal freemen were also there and urged us not to let the present favorable opportunity pass, believing, like us, that the fugitive slaves were being harbored by the carpenters, towards whom Harman had yesterday seen them take their course when he had captured one of them. Also in view of the fact that when their father, the old Gogosua, had been taken prisoner for the theft of the cattle belonging to Hendrik Boom, little commotion had been caused, but the cattle had been returned at once. The council, on the advice of the freemen, decided to keep prisoner Shkasher and Peter Otengo with another of the carpenters named Osahua. This was carried out at once. So daar was nou 4 mense gevangenes. Ek is nie seker oor of Gogosua nog steeds gevangenes is nie. This was carried out at once, and in explanation they were told that we had often seen Hottentot women giving the slaves broiled tortoises and other food and beckoning to them, pointing towards the leopard mountain. Further, that they had been unwilling to go out in search of the fugitives, and that other considerations also made us firmly believe that they were harboring the slaves in order to take them to the Kochokwas, who would take them on further to the Hankumkwas or Daga makers, so that we had resolved to keep the Hottentots mentioned as hostages until all the runaway slaves were restored. They were to stay for the time being in the kitchen of the surgeon, where they would be locked up and orders would be given for their good treatment. Nou maar die vryburgers het nou verkies die burgerraad. Julle kan daarop lees wie is verkies tot die burgerraad. Dit maak mens iets wat hulle in die verlede al gedoen het. Hierdie is nou net so half 'n herverkiesing. Nou gaan ons weer terug hierso na Eva en Domaan. The large number of Hottentots in the fort, and Harry too, looked rather surprised when they witnessed the arrest. But on learning that the captives would be well treated, they did not seem unduly alarmed, and said that they would go at once and search energetically for the slaves. They did not want to acknowledge that they knew where the slaves were, but Duman or Anthony, who had been to Batavia, was so angry that he could not restrain his anger, and said in the presence of all the Hottentots that the interpreter Eva had advised us to do this, wat waar is, and that he wished to destroy her at once. She immediately denied the charge, and though the charge was true, we confirmed the denial. We assured them that she had nothing to do with it, and that our action had been inspired by the intimacy we had recently observed between some of the women from the camp and of the carpenters and the slaves, and the fact that Skasher and Oldehoer had reported some days ago that they had seen the fugitives in the vicinity of the camp and could tell what they were doing. Anthony, however, would not cease accusing Eva, and he has proved in everything, and in particular in this case, that he is not to be trusted and that we should be on our guard against him. We sincerely wish that he had never been to Batavia, or that he may be induced to go back by fair words. There he has learnt how to use firearms effectively, and we are now obliged to exercise great care to keep them out of his hands. So dis maak met die oues om 'n trigger happy ook. Hier kom nog 'n resolusie. Jong, hier word nog resolusies geskryf hier in die Kaap. The interpreter Duman alias Anthony strongly urged us to seize another person belonging to Harry's people, the people who some time ago had stolen from us the 14 missing sheep and driven them away, so that they might thereby be persuaded to join the Kaapmans in looking for the blacks. From this it is quite evident that he belongs to the Kaapmans and Eva to Harry's people, though her mother lives in the camp of the Kaapmans, for each of them stands up for his or her side and slanders the other side, by which means we may very likely be able to discover the right man who murdered the herd 5 years ago and stole the Honourable Company's cattle. The senior merchant Willem Bastink was present during these incidents, and after he had been informed by us of the position as far as the limited time available permitted, the council and his honour's advice decided to add Jan Kou, one of Harry's people, to the number of hostages seized yesterday. Lest the Kaapmans should think that we disliked the one tribe more than the other, and also because we were assured by Duman that Harry's people laughed and ridiculed the Kaapmans because they alone were detained, which grieved them greatly and might cause a rupture between them. Their mutual jealousy is strong enough to precipitate this, which may enable us always to find out from the one what the other may be plotting against us, and in that way may be kept in such a state of alliance as would prove to be to the best advantage of the Honourable Company. Meanwhile both would be kept in subjection, as they dare not go far inland for fear of being robbed by the Saldaners. For if the latter should come down, the Kaapmans and Harry's people would return here and seek our protection. Indeed, it is becoming increasingly evident that the richer they become in cattle, the more they require our aid. It was therefore decided to make a hostage of Jan Kou, so that both parties might be equally zealous in their efforts to recover the slaves for us. This was neatly carried out at once. So dis maak met die ou was daar gewees, hulle het hom sommer net daar gearresteer. Shortly afterwards, Harry and Eva, with the interpreter Duman, came to the commander at the suggestion of the hostage. Skasher advised him to seize a hostage from among the principal men of the Gorachohukwas, or tobacco thieves. For if the three groups were treated equally, we should be more certain that the slaves would be recaptured. All this was listened to attentively by the council, strengthened by the Honourable Willem Bastink, and carefully considered. It was also clearly observed that the above-mentioned Hottentots were greatly concerned about the hostages and were now very obedient, meeting us in everything and particularly wanting to do penance, whilst they assured us that the same would be the case with the Gorachohukwas, should we hold them fast. In fact, that every tribe would be prepared to offer practically all its cattle for the release of the hostages. They were beginning to show themselves prepared to set the example and to submit to such conditions as we desired. In this way, we might succeed in subjecting them to our control by keeping hostages, either continually or perhaps exchanging the chief men from time to time. We may thereby gain our object with regard to cattle and be relieved of the necessity of putting into effect the plan to cut off the peninsula by constructing fortifications, for this would be a means of strengthening our defense against the tribes from the interior who might want to harm us, or it may become the means of drawing others to the fort, just as it may suit and serve the interest of the honourable company, for it would be far cheaper and provide more security than all the proposed fortifications. Having regard to these considerations, it was decided to accede to the request of Harry and Skasher to make a hostage of the chief of the Gorachohukwas as well, Harry and Skasher undertaking to entice him into the fort by means of fair words. In this way, it is hoped that good and satisfactory results may eventually be obtained, since the auguries are favourable. Thus done and resolved in the fort of Good Hope on the above date. Ons het nog so 'n week van die maand oor. Hoeveel bladsye is hier nog oor? Ek is nou al 'n uur en 'n half aan die gang. Mense, is nog baie leeswerk. Ek sien hierso is redelik genoem in die kletskolom. Is daar iets wat ek moet adresseer? Ok, ek gaan aandruk. Deurdruk. Meanwhile, the freemen had all been warned to be on their guard and to keep their weapons prepared lest they be surprised, and not to go about unarmed. For this purpose, those not provided with proper firearms were ordered to call at the company's armory to be equipped therewith. So Jan deel nou wapens vir al die vryburgers uit. Any person found alone anywhere without firearms hereafter, whether master or servant, shall forfeit 2 reals of 8 for each offence, in order to ensure that everyone shall keep his weapon in proper order at his own cost. It shall be inspected from time to time to see that it is not being neglected. Maar toe daar het almal nou ewe skielik wapens aan die Kaap, op die 24ste. By morning, 3 of the slaves had returned, a man and a woman belonging to Casper Brinkman, who were found standing before the door during the night, and a female slave who belonged to Jan Reinersen, who was found standing before the mill at daybreak. Just as in the case of the stolen cattle of Hendrik Boom, the slaves had evidently been brought back secretly to the house to give the impression that they had returned of their own accord. The thieves would not dare to return them personally for fear of detection, and would not like to acknowledge that the fugitives had ever been among them. This is of little importance as long as we get them back in this way and have no need to worry about their deserting. So nou, die klomp mense gearresteer en ewe skielik, hier spring die slawe op. Harry arrived this morning with no less than 25 fine Hottentots and asked for some bread for each of them on which to subsist while out looking for the slaves. For the reasons mentioned, these were all lies, but we pretended to believe them in order to get the Gorachohukwas into the trap more easily and to save the game in our hands. We therefore gave them bread and tobacco. Hier praat hulle van die Prins Willem fetching fuel. Hulle is natuurlijk besig om bome uit te kap. Bome uit te kap. Obtain from the trees that stood on the fine lands. En hulle sê hulle gaan nog daar loop ploeg. Laterand. Op die 26ste. Fine lovely weather. 3 Hottentots belonging to the Kaapmans personally brought back 2 Guinea slaves. A man and a woman belonging to the free burgher Casper Brinkman, who now has all 4 his slaves back again. Those still missing are 2 belonging to the freeman Jan Reinesen, a woman belonging to Harman, as well as 7 Angola slaves of the Honourable Company, for whom the Hottentots have promised to search diligently. For the purpose we had Harry slaughter an ox to provision his men, whilst we filled their knapsacks with bread, as they stated that the fugitives were already far away and would have to be searched for. Whether that was the case or not, we pretended to believe them, and to encourage them in their endeavours, we rewarded them for bringing back these 2 slaves with 6 copper plates and 6 long pieces of wire. Dus ek weet daar's julle kan seker ook getuig dat 1 koperplaat was redelik waardevol geweest, en dit smaak my hulle het 2 koperplate en 'n stuk reguit koper vir elke slaaf gegee. Hulle het 'n groot beloning gekry. As well as a liberal supply of tobacco, brandy and bread. This was evidently a strong inducement to others to join in the search. In the meantime, the hostages were well treated, etc. Praat hulle nou weer van die Prins Willem. En hier kom nou nog 'n resolution. Dis een resolusie na die ander een. Today the freemen requested that the slaves who had returned and were still confined should be punished as soon as possible and discharged in order that they could once again be employed in agriculture, for which their services were urgently needed. As it was apparent that it might take a long time to recover the fugitives still at large, the council, though it would have preferred to wait till all had been recovered so as to make a proper example of all of them at the same time, resolved to summon all the freemen with their slaves to the fort tomorrow and convene a meeting of the council to consult with the burgher councillors on the punishment to be inflicted on the fugitives as an example to the others in order to prevent further desertions. After the slaves have undergone their punishment, all of them all of them are to be sent back to their prospective masters to continue with the agricultural work for which their services are required. This done and resolved. So die ouens gaan 'n bietjie pak kry. Ons trek by die 29ste, einde van die maand sluit ek af. Cloudy sky and contrary north-northwesterly winds, breeze, prevented the Prince Willem from leaving. In the evening, a ship was sighted below the Robben Island today. Nee man, die interessante stuk begin eers hierso. Dis reg. Robben Island today. The council, assisted by the 2 chosen burgher councillors, passed sentence on the freemen's runaway male and female slaves who had been recovered as follows. All are to be tied to a post in the open and scourged. 1 is to be branded, while 2 are to be placed in chains linked to each other until their masters request that they be set free, as stated more fully in the sentences. Dan die Sondag. New moon, same wind in the morning. The ship mentioned entered the bay before the wind and safely reached the anchorage at about 8 o'clock. She is the little yacht Maria from the Saldanha Bay. Maria kom van Saldanha af en sy bring 12 sheep and a fine calf had also been obtained in Saldanha Bay, in addition to the 8 sheep killed for the crew. En hier kom ons weer terug by die diplomatie. The skipper reported that the natives from whom they had obtained the said animals had apparently plotted to attack the white men for the sake of the copper, and to kill all those who landed, but this conspiracy had been detected by our men and had consequently failed. They were the Charingurinas, otherwise known as the Charigruquas, who had some time ago plundered the boat of the Robbejacht in the Saldanha Bay and had intended to kill the men to get possession of their copper and tobacco. As often stated before, it is to be wished that we had their chief here in the fort as well, as to make them pay for their wantonness. Ek hoop ek spreek daai reg uit. En dan het ons troue alweer Wouter Cornelissen Mostert. wil graag trou met virtuous young woman. Hester Weiers of Leer. En daar natuurlik, as julle hou van die trou stories, daar bans to be published and what not. En dan hier praat ons nou weer oor Harry en die slawe. Amper 2 ure. Today, almost all the Hottentots belonging to the camps of the Kaapmans and Harry, who had been searching for the fugitive slaves, returned without any and reported that they could find none. Thereupon all the prisoners and their wives began to weep and wail lustily, as they had been told that they would not be released until all the slaves had been brought back to us. They evidently saw little chance of this happening just yet, partly perhaps because they were unable to recover the fugitives from those to whom they had been given or sent, and by whom they had already been taken far inland. The interpreter Duman, however, apparently maintains that they had never seen the fugitives who had run away of their own accord. This we showed him that we did not believe. On the contrary, we feel that we are correct in presuming the above, for the Hottentot women were too familiar with the slaves in the beginning and gave them many things. The result is that they have to be satisfied to remain in captivity until we recover the slaves or know what has really become of them. This made the interpreter Duman hang his head and seem much depressed, as also Eva, who said that the Hottentots would kill her if we did not release Skasher, the son of the chief of the Kaapmans. She was told to keep within the fort, and that if anyone harmed her, the commander would have him captured as well. To set the minds of the hostages at rest, the commander in person told them to have no fear, for no harm would come to them, and said that everything was being done to recover the runaway slaves. They were given some tobacco, bread and brandy, which seemed to cheer them up somewhat. Die ouens is maar droewig. Ek gaan wragtig 2 ure vanaand stream, maar ek moet aandruk. Luister julle nog? Gee julle nog aandag? The Honourable Willem Bastink therefore came ashore again, and in his presence the interpreter Duman, in the name of the fat captain of the Kaapmans, Gogosua, proposed to the commander that as it was impossible to recover the rest of the slaves, Skasher, the chief's son, should be released, in return for which he would bring a present of good draft oxen. It was suggested that in his place Harry should be made prisoner and all his cattle taken from him, for he had after all obtained these from the Chainohukwas, when he was sent inland with the company's copper, and had delivered only 10 to the commander, which was indeed true. Moreover, 5 years ago, Harry had caused the herd boy to be slain by Jan Kau, who was now our prisoner, and by another named Bohubo, who was still with him, and had thereafter carried off all the company's cattle. Jan Kau had also stolen the 15 sheep last found to be missing, and they were now among Harry's flock. As a matter of fact, all that Harry possesses belonged to the company. Apart from this, he was just a poor wretch and merely chief of the watermen or strandlopers here at the Cape. Nou hierdie is nou die Kaapmans wat so getuig dat Harry is eintlik maar 'n niemandie. Duman was thereupon asked whether this would please the other Hottentots, namely the Khoyachohukwas, Charingerinas, and also the real Saldaners, such as the Chainohukwas, Kochokwas, etc. And he replied, yes, and that it was not to be doubted. When he was told that their chiefs should themselves visit the commander to consult with one another on the matter, he replied that only the Gorachohukwas, Gogosua, the chief of the Kaapmans, and a certain Siggenman named Ankaisua, rich in sheep, live hereabouts, and that to them alone the land of the Cape belonged, so that whatever they decided, the others would be satisfied as long as Harry could be made away with. He was told that the chiefs of the Kaapmans and the Gorachohukwas with Siggenman should come to the commander to consult together. He thereupon left to report this to them. The Honourable Willem Bestink again came ashore at the request of the commander to consult with him in the council about the present state of affairs. The following resolution was adopted. Mense, dit is nou, ek wil baie graag deurdruk. Ek wil baie graag deurdruk. Ek is al klaar by Julie. Ek moes al hier gestop het. Ek gee julle te veel informasie. Ek het so lekker gelees, ek het skoon verby die hele storie gelees. Maar soos julle kan sien, die pap raak nou dik hierso. Die pap raak nou dik hier aan die Kaap. Tomino het gedoog, dis Harry wat die ou doodgemaak het. Wel, die still facilitated it. Ja, so, daar kom nou redelijk duidelikheid, want hierdie is nou hofsake basis. Jy kan sien, hulle hanteer het ook as 'n hofsaak, die terminologie wat hulle gebruik ensovoorts. Kom eens kyk, het ek iets gemis hier boontoe? Julle is so lekker onder mekaar gesels. Ek het nou gelukkig van julle nie aan die slaap gepraat nie. Mike Simpson sê, hy is 'n opregte soutie. Ok mense, ek dink dit is dit. Ek dink dit is dit vir nou. So ek gaan sommer hier afsit, ek is nou amper 2. Volgende week gaan ek weer begin met die eerste. Want dit is nou juist hierso waar daar besluit word om vir Harry in hegtenis te neem en so aan. En dit sal 'n goeie begin wees vir die volgende episode. Ek wil vir julle sê baie dankie dat julle ingeskakel het. Onthou, daar is absoluut geen skaamte daarin om jou kop uit jou gat te trek nie. Staan op vir daardie mense wat vir jou opstaan en soos altyd volhard in hou koers.